there is no way. Hamas isn't going to, quote, surrender. You know that that's not going to happen. And there's going to be no way to effectively end Hamas. You may be able to degrade their ability. You may kill a lot of fighters. But there's not going to be a way to, quote, unquote, eliminate Hamas entirely, right?
No, we don't accept that. We think that you can remove it from power, just as the United States...
Remove it from power is different from eliminating.
We will dismantle its military and governing infrastructure so it can no longer govern Gaza in the way it has used it in the last 16 years to oppress the Palestinian people and terrorize Israelis, or use it as one massive launch pad for rockets against Israel, just as the US and 85 nations ganged together 10 years ago to remove ISIS from power in Syria and Iraq. It was difficult, it was bloody, but in the end, that terrorist group was removed from power so it could no longer use territory to use as a base for attacks against people around the world, and we will do the same. By the way, our military campaign has far exceeded expectations. Half of Hamas's terrorists are either dead, wounded, or apprehended. It started the war with 24 battalions, 18 have been shattered. Essentially, only the last 4 in Rafah are still on its feet, and the vast underground military tunnel network we are systematically destroying, taking out those underground headquarters where Hamas has been trying, in the most evil, despicable way, to hide underneath.
Well, we all know that they're using civilians as human shields.
Well, we all know that. I've been surprised in many media interviews I do. It's not obvious.
Okay, well, it's obvious here, all right? On this program, it is an obvious reality that Hamas is intentionally not just using them, intentionally using humans, civilians as shields in an effort to protect themselves. Agreed. But the reality is there's still an enormous number of Gazans who are now suffering. And that's, as I was just saying to Cenk, that's bad for Israel, right? I mean, when civilians are getting killed, it's bad for Israel. When civilians in Gaza are borderline starving, that's bad for Israel. So I would think that even though, as I just said to Cenk, it's ridiculous that Hamas won't release the names of the hostages, that it still might be in Israel's interest to make a deal so that they can take some of the pressure off of itself in the international world.
Look, of course, human suffering is tragic, and for us, every civilian casualty is a tragedy. For Hamas, it is a strategy. Hamas does this deliberately because if it maximizes civilian casualties, it increases international pressure on Israel to stop. Now, we've gone further than any army in the history of the world to try to mitigate civilian casualties, because no army in the history of the world has ever tried to implement the rules of international law. In a battlefield in which terrorists have spent 16 years deliberately redesigning Gaza's cityscape to build a network of tunnels 1.5 times the length of the New York subway, with schools, with tunnel shafts inside schools and homes and hospitals and mosques. So we're doing everything we can to minimize harm.
Do you think a ceasefire is going to happen?
Well, look, there's going to be no ceasefire that leaves the hostages in Gaza or Hamas in power. We do want to see a temporary pause to enable us to get the hostages out. It has been 150 days where those poor hostages are being starved and tortured, executed, raped. Just today, the UN Special Rapporteur on Sexual Violence in Conflict spoke of clear and credible information that hostages are being sexually abused right now. Their families are suffering, they're going through living hell, and we need to get those hostages out, all of them, now, immediately, and unconditionally.
But of course, as a practical matter, that can't happen, right? I mean, you know, you're going to have to literally eliminate every single one of the Hamas folks before they'll release those hostages.
And we are continuing to put military pressure on Hamas because it's the only thing that's going to work. Standing by on the sidelines and asking Hamas nicely to give back the hostages it brutally abducted was never going to work. How did we get the last 105 out in late November when we had another pause in the fighting? It was because Hamas was getting clobbered and it was begging for a breather.
Final question, how do you get more aid into Gaza?
Well, Israel has excess capacity at its crossings to get aid into Gaza. Just yesterday, we had a record number of trucks entering Gaza, 277 trucks. That's on top of 250,000 tons of aid entering Gaza. The problem isn't getting aid into Gaza. It's distributing it. The problem is that the UN has been struggling to distribute aid at the pace that Israel is getting it in, and that's why at the Gazan side of the Kerem Shalom crossing, you have hundreds of trucks worth of aid piling up because, as the US State Department admitted just this week, UNRWA, the UN agency that is complicit with Hamas, distributes that aid using Hamas protection. The UN has been relying on Hamas protection to distribute aid. We're seeing no more. We're trying to get aid to the people who need it in a way that makes sure Hamas cannot steal it, and everyone in Gaza understands. This is a war against Hamas, which started this brutal war with 10/7, not against the Palestinian people. And when this war is over, we hope to have new horizons for peace and coexistence.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find News Nation on your cable provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.